The town believed the boy was kidnapped, until his journal surfaced 24 years later. The dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight, the only things moving in the attic. They were silver ghosts in the oppressive heat, swirling in the air. That was thick with the ghosts of other things: mothballs, cedar, forgotten Christmases. Outside, the cicadas screamed a relentless, high-pitched thrum against the humid Georgia night. A sound that usually meant summer, safety, home, but not tonight. Tonight, it was the soundtrack to a violation. Sheriff Brody Mullins felt a bead of sweat trace a path from his temple down his jaw, dropping with a soft, obscene plink onto the dusty floorboards. He didn't wipe it. He couldn't move. His eyes were fixed on the small, leather-bound book in his gloved hand. It felt heavier than it should. Weighted with the years it had spent tucked inside a hollowed-out copy of Moby Dick. 24 years. A lifetime. The attic belonged to Eleanor Pike, a woman whose mind had become as cluttered and forgotten as the space around them. She'd passed 2 weeks ago, and her estranged daughter, a sharp-faced woman from Atlanta with no time for sentiment, had been the one to call it in. Just a bunch of old junk, she'd said over the phone, her voice brittle. But there's a diarrhea. I think you need to see it. Brody hadn't expected this. He'd expected teenage angst, maybe some neighborhood gossip. Not this, not the careful, looping cursive of a 12-year-old boy. Not Leo Vance. Leo Vance was a ghost of a different sort. He was the town's collective wound, the empty space at the dinner table in every family's heart. On a sticky August afternoon in 1999, he had walked out of his front door to meet his friends at the creek, and had simply vanished. The search was the stuff of local legend. Hundreds of volunteers combing the woods, divers in the murky creek water, bloodhounds howling at the edge of the kudzu-choked forest until their throats were raw. They'd found nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of his red t-shirt, not a single drop of blood. The official story, the one that had settled over the town of Harmony Creek like a shroud, was kidnapping. A stranger, a predator, had snatched him. It was the only explanation that made sense, the only one that allowed people to sleep at night, to let their own children play in their yards again, albeit with a new sharp-edged fear that never quite went away. But this journal told a different story. Brody's thumb, clumsy in the latex glove, traced the gold-embossed letters on the cover. LV. He opened it again, the spine cracking in the silence. The beam of his flashlight trembled, casting dancing shadows on the slanted ceiling. He'd already read the first few entries, his heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm against his ribs. They were filled with the mundane anxieties of a 12-year-old boy, a crush on a girl named Sarah Jenkins, the dread of a math test, the desperate want for a new bike. Then the tone shifted. July 10, 1999, Mr. Abernathy gave me a new job today. Not just mowing the lawn. He said I was old enough for real responsibility. He wants me to help him in his workshop. He called me his special apprentice. He has this smell, like cinnamon and something else, something sharp, like the stuff Mum uses to clean the windows. Brody's stomach clenched. Judge Abernathy, Marcus Abernathy. The man was more than a pillar of the community. He was its foundation. His family had practically built Harmony Creek. He was the stern, silver-haired man who handed out trophies at the Little League games. The one whose booming voice from the pulpit every Sunday reminded them of God's grace and their own civic duty. He had led the search for Leo. He had stood beside Leo's parents, his arm around the weeping mother, his face a mask of grim determination. He had delivered a eulogy at the memorial service a year later that had left the entire town in tears, a masterpiece of shared grief and righteous anger. July 15, 1999. The workshop is weird. It's in the basement. He locks the door when we go down there. He says it's to keep the sawdust from getting in the main house, but there's no sawdust. It's clean, too clean. There are tools on the walls, but they're all shiny, like they've never been used. He has a camera. A big one, on a tripod. He said it's for his art projects. He told me not to tell anyone about them. It's our secret, a special secret, just for his apprentice. A cold dread slick and oily, seeped into Brody's bones. He could feel the attic shrinking, the air thinning. The cicadas outside seemed to be screaming Leo's name. Leo, Leo, Leo. He flipped a few more pages, his breath catching in his throat. The entries grew shorter, the handwriting more frantic, more slanted. The boyish loops were gone, replaced by sharp, jagged letters that seemed to claw at the page. July 22, 1999, he calls it, the stillness game. I have to lie on the table in the middle of the room and be as still as I can. He says it's a test of discipline. He shines a bright light in my eyes and tells me to pretend I'm sleeping. He takes pictures. Lots of pictures. He touches me. He says it's to make sure I'm not tense. His hands are cold, they feel like stones. Like this game. I told him I wanted to stop, and he got quiet. His face got tight. He said a good apprentice doesn't question the master. He said he knows my dad is having trouble at the mill. He said he could make that trouble go away, or he could make it worse. Brody slammed the journal shut. The sound was a gunshot in the silence. He was gasping, sucking in the hot, dead air. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a predator who had stalked the edges of their town. It was someone they knew, someone they trusted, someone they revered. The monster hadn't come from the outside. He had been living in the heart of Harmony Creek all along. He stumbled back, knocking over a stack of old newspapers. They cascaded to the floor, yellowed and brittle. A headline from 1999 stared up at him. Community praise for Leo Vance's safe return. And there, in the accompanying photo, was Judge Abernathy, his arm around Leo's father, his face a perfect portrait of civic anguish. The hypocrisy was a physical blow, knocking the wind from Brody's lungs. He had to get out of there. He had to get this to the station. He had to what? What could he do? Judge Abernathy wasn't just a man. He was an institution. He was 82 years old now, frail and revered, living in the biggest house in town, a historic landmark. He was a living saint. And Leo was a ghost, a 24-year-old memory. This journal was the only thing that gave him a voice. Brody's flashlight beam cut across the attic, landing on a small wooden chest tucked under the eaves. It wasn't like the other dusty boxes. It was clean, deliberately placed. He moved towards it, his heart hammering. He knelt, his old knees protesting, and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed lace, was a collection of things. A dried corsage, a baby's silver rattle, a stack of postcards tied with a faded ribbon, and underneath it all, a small metal lockbox. It was the kind a child would use for treasures. It wasn't locked. His fingers trembled as he opened it. The contents were sparse. A single, tarnished silver locket, and a stack of photographs, held together by a thick rubber band. He pulled them out. His blood ran cold. The first photo was of a young girl, maybe 16, with a familiar, sharp-faced resentment in her eyes. It was Eleanor Pike's daughter, the one who had called him. She was standing in front of the judge's grand house, a forced smile on her face. The second was of another girl, one he didn't recognize, but she had the same haunted look. The third was Leo. He was lying on a table, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended the faded colors of the photograph. He was pale, his freckles standing out like flecks of dirt on his skin. He was wearing only his underwear. The bright, clinical light from the photographer's lamp glinted off the tears, tracking through the dust on his cheeks. It was the stillness game. Brody felt a wave of nausea so profound he had to brace himself against the chest. He flipped to the next photo, and the next. They were all the same, different children, different years, boys and girls, all with the same vacant, terrified eyes, all in the same clean, sterile room, all playing the same sick game. This wasn't just about Leo. This was a graveyard. This attic was a mausoleum of stolen childhoods. Eleanor Pike hadn't just been the judge's neighbor. What had she been? A witness? An accomplice? Why keep this? Why hide it away for all these years? His light fell on the last item in the lockbox. A single, unexposed roll of 35mm film in a black plastic canister. It felt cold, dense, a tiny cylinder of pure potential horror. What was on it? More pictures. Pictures of what happened after the stillness game. A floorboard creaked downstairs. Bruni froze, every muscle in his body tensing. The cicadas outside had stopped. The sudden absolute silence was more terrifying than their noise. He held his breath, listening. "Sheriff," a voice called from the bottom of the attic stairs. It was Deputy Allen, his young, eager Tupley subordinate. "Everything okay up there? You've been up here a while." Brody didn't answer. His mind was racing. The journal, the photos, the roll of film. This was evidence. This was a bomb that would not just shatter Judge Abernathy's reputation. It would obliterate the very foundation of Harmony Creek. The town's history, its identity was built on a lie, and he was holding the truth in his hands. He could hear Allen's footsteps on the stairs now, slow, heavy. Why was he here? Brody had told him to wait in the car. Sheriff Mullins. Allen's voice was closer now, just on the other side of the attic door. There was a new edge to it, not concern, something else. Something that made the hairs on Brody's arms stand up. Brody's eyes darted around the attic, searching for another way out, but there was none. Only the single door and a small sealed window overlooking the backyard. He was trapped. He shoved the journal and the photos into the deep pockets of his jacket. He clutched the roll of film in his fist, the plastic cool and smooth against his sweaty palm. The attic door creaked open. The beam of another flashlight cut through the darkness, blinding him. "Sheriff Allen," said again, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He stepped into the attic, and he wasn't alone. Behind him, silhouetted in the doorway, was another figure. Tall, stooped with age, but unmistakable. The silver hair seemed to glow in the backlight. Judge Abernathy. He took a slow, deliberate step into the attic, his eyes, even in the dim light, burning with a cold, ancient fire. He looked at Brody, then at the open chest, and a thin, bloodless smile touched his lips. "I believe you have something that belongs to me, Sheriff," the judge said. His voice the same calm, resonant baritone that had captivated juries and congregations for 50 years. It was the voice of reason, of authority, of God. But in the suffocating silence of the attic, it was the most terrifying sound Brody had ever heard. Allen raised his flashlight, the beam centering on Brody's face. In his other hand, he was holding his service weapon, the barrel pointed directly at Brody's chest. "I was hoping it wouldn't come to this," the judge said, his voice laced with a performer's disappointment. "But secrets, like bodies, have a way of rising to the surface, don't they? Especially when you don't bury them deep enough." The world narrowed to the barrel of that gun, the cold, unblinking eye of the judge, and the weight of the film canister in Brody's hand. The cicadas started screaming again, a frantic, deafening shriek, as if they knew the world was about to end. Brody's heart was a trapped bird beating against his ribs. He had unearthed a monster, and now, in the dusty tomb of a dead woman's secrets, the monster had come to bury him with them. Leo Vance was a cartographer of small worlds. His domain was the 4-block radius around his house, a kingdom of cracked sidewalks, whispering pines, and the forbidden, thrilling territory of the drainage ditch behind the Piggly Wiggly. He was a boy built of skinned knees, grass-stained jeans, and a quiet, watchful intensity. His eyes, a shade of blue so pale they were almost gray, missed nothing. He saw the way Mrs. Gable's prize-winning roses drooped when she forgot to water them. The exact spot where the mailman's dog always lifted its leg against the Henderson's oak tree. The flicker of fear in his mother's eyes when his father came home from the mill. His shoulders slumped, the smell of sawdust and defeat clinging to him like a second skin. His father, Frank Vance, was a good man, whittled down by life. He had hands like worn leather, calloused and strong, but a spirit that had been sanded smooth by disappointment. The mill, once the lifeblood of Harmony Creek, was gasping its last breaths, and Frank was tied to it, a man going down with a ship he didn't build. He loved Leo with a fierce, quiet desperation. A love that manifested in meticulously repaired bike chains and gruff one-word affirmations. He saw the world in black and white, in right and wrong, and the gray areas were a fog he couldn't navigate. The idea that evil could wear a suit and tie, that it could sit on the town council and quote scripture, was a concept as foreign to him as the surface of the moon. Leo's mother, Maria, was the opposite. She lived in the gray. She was a woman of unspoken anxieties and whispered prayers, her love for Leo a constant humming current beneath the surface of their lives. She painted watercolors, mostly soft, blurry landscapes of the creek, the woods. The world she wished was as gentle as her brushstrokes made it seem. She was terrified of everything: thunderstorms, stray dogs, the ever-present shadow of the mill closing. But her greatest fear was the fragility of her son's innocence. She saw the watchfulness in his eyes, and it scared her, because she knew that boys who see too much are the first to have their hearts broken. Leo's journal was his sanctuary, the one place he could map the territories of his own heart. It was where he confessed his secret ambition to be an astronaut, where he drew detailed diagrams of imaginary spaceships, where he practiced writing Sarah Jenkins' name over and over in swooping, elaborate script. It was a place of safety, a fortress of paper and ink, until Judge Abernathy gave him the key to a new, darker world. Marcus Abernathy was a man carved from granite and old money. He lived in a house that wasn't just a home but a statement, a white-columned monument to his family's enduring power. His world was one of order, control, and the quiet, unassailable conviction of his own righteousness. He saw the people of Harmony Creek not as neighbors, but as subjects, a flock to be guided by his firm, benevolent hand. He believed in discipline, in tradition, in the idea that some men were born to lead and others to follow, and children, in his view, were the most malleable of all. They were blank slates upon which he could etch his own desires, his own twisted sense of art. His wife had died years ago, a quiet, faded woman who had long since retreated into the shadows of his personality. He had no children of his own. His legacy, he believed, would not be one of flesh and blood, but of influence, of the indelible mark he left on the town, and on the chosen few, his apprentices. He selected them carefully. He looked for a certain quality, a flicker of loneliness, a hint of vulnerability, a family on the brink of some small desperation that he could exploit. He saw it in Leo Vance. He saw the boy's quiet intelligence, the subtle hunger for approval from a man who wasn't his weary, defeated father. He saw a canvas. The hidden witness was Eleanor Pike. In 1999, she was a ghost in her own life. A widow in her late 50s, she lived in the house next door to the judge, a house that was slowly, inexorably succumbing to the same neglect that had claimed her spirit. She was a creature of routine and fear. Her husband, a domineering man who had worked as the judge's groundskeeper, had died of a heart attack 5 years prior, leaving her with a house she couldn't afford and a silence that was louder than his shouting had ever been. Her connection to the judge was one of terrified obligation. He'd helped her after her husband's death, managing her finances, ensuring she could stay in her home. It was a kindness that felt like a cage. She owed him. He never let her forget it. She saw things from her upstairs bedroom window, which looked directly into the judge's basement. She saw the boys and the girls. She saw them arrive, their faces scrubbed and hopeful, and she saw them leave, their shoulders slumped, a new, hollow look in their eyes. She saw Leo Vance go in that August afternoon, his red t-shirt a bright slash of color against the judge's manicured lawn. She never saw him come out. The sound from the basement was faint, muffled by earth and concrete, but to Eleanor, it was a scream. It had started a few weeks after Leo disappeared. A rhythmic scraping sound, scrape, drag, scrape. It always happened late at night, when the rest of Harmony Creek was asleep. She would lie in her bed, the floral pattern of her wallpaper swimming in the dark, and listen. She knew what it was. The judge was expanding his workshop, digging, making more room for his art. Her daughter, Catherine, was her only link to the outside world, a link that was stretched thin and frayed with resentment. Catherine had escaped Harmony Creek the moment she'd turned 18, fleeing to Atlanta with a scholarship and a burning need to put the town and its suffocating secrets in her rearview mirror. She saw her mother's fear, her deliberate blindness, as a weakness, a betrayal. "Why don't you just move, Mum?" she'd plead during her rare obligatory visits. "Sell this place. Come live with me." Eleanor would just shake her head, her hands fluttering in her lap like trapped birds. "I can't, honey, the judge. He's been so good to me. He's a creep." Catherine would spit, her voice sharp with a frustration that was really a form of love, the way he looks at people, like they're bugs under a microscope. "And you're terrified of him. I can see it." The tension between them was a constant, low-grade fever. Catherine didn't know the half of it. She didn't know about the lockbox her mother kept hidden in the attic, a penance and a poison she couldn't bring herself to discard. Years ago, shortly after her husband died, the judge had given it to her for safekeeping. "Just some old memories, Eleanor," he'd said, his voice smooth as silk. "Things I can't bear to have in my own home. Too painful." He had patted her hand, his touch cold and dry. "I know I can trust you to be discreet." It was a test, a leash. She knew it the moment he handed it to her. She had opened it once, just once, her hands shaking so badly she could barely lift the lid. The photographs had burned themselves into her memory. She had seen the faces of children from town, children who had suddenly become quiet, withdrawn. She had slammed it shut, her heart pounding with a terror so pure it was almost holy. She had hidden it in the attic, in her late husband's old chest, a secret buried within. A secret. It was her sin of omission, her silent complicity. The day Leo vanished, the fragile ecosystem of Harmony Creek shattered. The search was a frantic communal performance of grief. Frank Vance, his face a grey mask of disbelief, walked the woods, until his feet were bloody, calling his son's name, until his voice was a raw whisper. Maria Vance sat in her living room, surrounded by well-meaning neighbors offering casseroles and platitudes, her eyes fixed on the door, convinced Leo would walk through it at any moment, covered in mud and grinning. Judge Abernathy was the director of this grim theater. He organized the search parties, his voice a steady, commanding presence in the chaos. He stood before the television cameras, his expression a perfect blend of sorrow and strength, and spoke of the sanctity of their community, the evil that had invaded their paradise. "We will not rest," he'd boomed, his words echoing in every living room in town, "until we find this monster and bring him to justice. We will bring our boy home." Eleanor Pike watched him on her small, flickering television, her stomach churning. She saw the way he placed his hand on Frank Vance's shoulder, a gesture of comfort that looked, to her, like an act of possession. She knew where Leo was. He was under the judge's house, under the pristine workshop, under the shiny, unused tools. He was in the place the scraping sounds came from. She clutched the silver locket that she had taken from the lockbox, a small, cold piece of proof that felt like a brand on her soul. She had to do something. She had to tell someone. She picked up the phone, her hand trembling. She dialed the first two numbers of the sheriff's office. Then she stopped. She looked out her window at the judge's house, its white columns gleaming in the afternoon sun like bleached bones. She thought of the lockbox in her attic. She thought of his cold, knowing eyes. She thought of the help he had given her, the invisible chains that bound her to him. Fear, cold and absolute, washed over her. She was a fly in his web, and any struggle would only draw his attention. She slowly, carefully, placed the receiver back in its cradle. The silence that followed was the sound of her own damnation. The weeks that followed, the town's grief curdled into a kind of grim acceptance. The search parties dwindled. The yellow ribbons tied around the oak trees faded and grew tattered. Leo Vance became a story, a cautionary tale whispered to children at bedtime. Don't talk to strangers. Don't wander off. The monster was an outsider, a phantom. It had to be. To believe otherwise was to believe that the very ground beneath their feet was poisoned. Only one person refused to let the story end. Deputy Brodie Mullins. He was young then, just a few years on the force, full of a fierce, uncomplicated sense of justice that hadn't yet been worn down by politics and compromise. He'd been one of the first on the scene the day Leo disappeared. He remembered the eerie stillness of the Vance house, the half-eaten bowl of cereal on the kitchen table, the palpable absence of the boy. It had gotten under his skin. He'd interviewed everyone. The friends Leo was supposed to meet, the neighbors, the mailman. He'd gone over the same ground 100 times, searching for the one detail that didn't fit, and he'd found it. A small, insignificant thing that no one else seemed to notice. Every kid in the neighborhood knew the shortcut to the creek. It was a well-worn path through the woods behind their houses. But Leo hadn't taken it. His friends, waiting for him at the creek, had seen him walk down his front path and turn right, in the opposite direction, towards the center of town, towards the grand, imposing house on the corner. Brodie had brought this up to the sheriff at the time, a portly, nearing retirement man named Henderson. The kid was going to Judge Abernathy's place, Brodie had insisted, spreading a map. On the sheriff's desk, it's the only thing in that direction. Henderson had waved a dismissive hand. The judge was a friend of the family. Son, he was helping the boy's father with some legal matters. Leo probably just went to drop something off, a distraction. The real trail is in the woods. Brodie had tried to argue, but it was like arguing with a brick wall. The judge was untouchable, a figure beyond reproach. To even suggest he was connected to this was blasphemy. Brodie had gone to the judge's house himself, hat in hand. Abernathy had been gracious, patient, his face a mask of paternal concern. Yes, the boy was here, the judge had admitted smoothly, offering Brodie a glass of iced tea, a fine young man, so much potential. He mows my lawn, you know. He stopped by for his payment, a $10 bill. He was here for no more than 5 minutes. Then he was on his way to meet his friends. The judge had looked Brodie directly in the eye, his gaze unwavering. A terrible, terrible tragedy. I pray for his safe return every night. It was a perfect story. Plausible, simple, and delivered with absolute conviction. But it felt wrong. The timing was too neat. The explanation to clean. Brodie felt a prickle of unease, a sense of a carefully constructed facade. But he had nothing, no evidence, no witnesses, just a gut feeling. And in a town like Harmony Creek, a gut feeling was no match for the word of Judge Marcus Abernathy. The case went cold, but for Brodie, it never closed. It sat in the back of his mind, a locked room he could never find the key to. Until, 24 years later, a woman in Atlanta cleaning out her dead mother's house sent him a map. The years after Leo's disappearance were a slow, grinding erosion of hope for the Vance family. The initial storm of community support, the casseroles and prayer circles, eventually subsided, leaving them stranded on a desolate island of grief. The town moved on, as towns do. The yellow ribbons rotted away, new children were born, and the story of the lost boy became a piece of local folklore, a ghost story to tell around campfires. But for Frank and Maria Vance, time stopped in August of 1999. Frank's quiet desperation curdled into a brittle, simmering anger. He returned to the mill, the rhythmic clang and roar of the machinery, a welcome distraction from the silence in his own head. But he was a changed man. The easy smile he once had was gone, replaced by a permanent tight-lipped grimace. He saw suspicion in every unfamiliar face, a potential threat in every passing car. He argued with his coworkers, his fuse shortened. To a nub, he began to drink. Not heavily at first, just a few beers after work to take the edge off the pain. But the edge was a cliff, and soon he was tumbling into a dark, alcoholic haze. His anger found a target in Maria. He couldn't protect his son, so he lashed out at the one person left. He blamed her for being too soft, for not being watchful. Enough, you were home, he'd roar, his voice thick with whiskey and grief. You were right there in the house, painting your stupid little pictures, and you just let him walk out the door. The accusations were a physical assault, leaving bruises on Maria's soul. Her own grief, a vast, silent ocean, was something she had to navigate alone. The watercolors dried up in their pans. Her brushes gathered dust. She stopped painting the world she wished for, and instead simply tried to survive the one she was in. She became a ghost in her own home, flitting from room to room, cleaning and re-cleaning things that were already spotless. Her movements small and quiet, as if trying not to disturb the fragile peace. She spent hours in Leo's room, sitting on the edge of his bed, her hand resting on the faded Star Wars bedspread, inhaling the faint, lingering scent of her son. The cruelty of the town's forgetfulness was a constant torment. People would cross the street to avoid her, their faces etched with a pained pity she couldn't bear. At the Piggly Wiggly, she'd hear the whispers, the sideways glances. The Vances were a living reminder of the darkness that had touched their perfect town, and people grew tired of being reminded. The true architect of their misery, Judge Abernathy, only tightened his grip. He performed his role as the grieving community leader with chilling perfection. He established the Leo Vance Scholarship Fund, a yearly award given to a promising young student. The ceremony was a public spectacle of his benevolence, a chance for him to stand before the town and speak of resilience and hope, his voice resonating with false empathy. He would always invite the Vances, a cruel, calculated gesture of his power. Frank, in his drunken haze, would sometimes go standing at the back of the school auditorium, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. But Maria could never bring herself to attend. The sight of the judge, the sound of his voice speaking her son's name, was a violation she could not endure. One year, about 5 years after Leo vanished, the judge made a personal visit to their small, dilapidated house. He arrived in his gleaming black Lincoln, a symbol of the chasm that separated their worlds. He brought a check. "For the fund, Maria," he said, his voice a low, soothing purr. He stood in their cramped living room, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the threadbare furniture. A small token of the town's continued sympathy. Maria stared at the check in his outstretched hand. It was for $5,000. More money than she and Frank had seen in years. It felt like blood money. "We don't want it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The judge's smile didn't falter, but a coldness crept into his eyes. "Now, Maria, this isn't for you. It's for Leo's legacy. It's to help other children. Surely you want that." Frank stumbled in from the kitchen, his eyes red-rimmed, the smell of bourbon on his breath. He saw the check and sneered. "We don't need your charity, Judge." Abernathy's gaze shifted to Frank, his expression hardening almost imperceptibly. "I understand your pain, Frank, I truly do, but bitterness won't bring him back. The mill is laying off another 20 men next month. A man in your position, a man with a family to think about, should be careful about biting the hand that feeds." The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. The judge had connections everywhere, including the board of the failing mill. He could crush Frank with a single phone call. The power imbalance was absolute, suffocating. Frank's face flushed with a helpless rage. He was a cornered animal. He snatched the check from the judge's hand. "Get out of my house." The judge gave a slow, satisfied nod. He had won. He had reminded them of their place. As he turned to leave, his eyes met Maria's. In that brief, silent moment, she saw it. A flicker of something monstrous. A glint of triumphant cruelty. It was a look that said, "I own you. I own your grief. I own your son." The air left her lungs. She knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that this man was not just a benefactor, he was the devil himself. For Eleanor Pike, the witness next door, the conflict was an internal, silent war. The scraping sounds from the judge's basement had stopped after a few months, but the silence that replaced them was even more terrifying. It was the silence of a sealed tomb. Her life became a series of rituals designed to avoid him. She learned the sound of his car, the rhythm of his footsteps on the gravel driveway. She would watch from behind her lace curtains as he came and went, her heart pounding a frantic tattoo against her ribs. The lockbox in her attic was a constant physical presence. It was a tumor in her house, radiating a cold secret poison. Several times she resolved to get rid of it. She would march up the attic stairs, her jaw set, only to freeze at the sight of the chest. To destroy it felt like destroying the only proof, the only thing that could ever give those children a voice. But to take it to the authorities, that was unthinkable. The judge's power was absolute. He would destroy her. He would paint her as a crazy old woman, a liar, an accomplice. She was trapped, a prisoner in her own home. Held captive by a secret she was too terrified to keep, and too terrified to reveal. Her daughter Catherine's visits became more infrequent. The phone calls more strained. Catherine could feel the wall of fear around her mother, and it infuriated her. "He's just a man, Mum," she yelled during one heated phone call. "An old man. What are you so afraid of? You don't understand," Eleanor whispered, twisting the phone cord around her fingers. "You don't know what he's capable of. Then tell me. For God's sake, tell me what's going on." But she couldn't. The words would die in her throat, choked by a fear that had taken root in her soul. The secret was a part of her now. To speak it would be to tear herself apart. The distance between mother and daughter grew into a vast, unbridgeable chasm of misunderstanding and resentment. Eleanor was utterly alone with her terrible knowledge. The judge, meanwhile, grew bolder. His art projects continued, though he became more discreet. He chose his new apprentices from neighboring towns, children whose disappearances wouldn't be connected to Harmony Creek. He was a predator who had learned to vary his hunting grounds. His reputation as a philanthropist and a saint only grew, polished to a high sheen by years of public service and carefully managed optics. He was a master of deception. His life a meticulously crafted performance. The humiliation of the Vances was a crucial part of that performance. It was a public demonstration of his power. About 10 years after Leo's disappearance, the town decided to dedicate a small park in Leo's name. It was the judge's idea, of course. A memorial bench, a small plaque, a newly planted oak tree. Another public ceremony, another chance for the judge to display his magnanimity. This time, he insisted the Vances be there, on the dais with him. He sent a car for them. Maria refused, locking herself in her bedroom. But Frank, his will eroded by years of alcohol and despair, allowed himself to be led to the event. He stood on the stage, blinking in the bright sunlight, a hollowed-out shell of a man. The judge placed a heavy hand on his shoulder and began to speak. He spoke of Leo, of the boy's bright smile and boundless energy. He spoke of the town's enduring love, of the strength of their community. It was a beautiful speech, full of soaring rhetoric and heartfelt sentiment, and it was all a lie. As the judge's voice washed over the crowd, Frank looked out at the faces of his neighbors. He saw their pity, their discomfort. He saw the way they looked at him, the father of the lost boy, the town drunk, a tragic, broken figure. And then he looked at the judge, so calm, so powerful, so revered. The hypocrisy, the sheer, monstrous injustice of it all, finally broke through the alcoholic fog. A guttural sound, a roar of pure, undiluted anguish, tore from Frank's throat. He lunged at the judge, his hands clawing, his face a mask of rage. "You did this," he screamed, his voice raw with a decade of unspeakable pain. "You liar. You goddamn liar." The crowd gasped. 2 deputies, one of them, a young, newly promoted Brody Mullins, rushed forward. They grabbed Frank, wrestling him away from the stunned judge. Frank fought like a wild animal, his limbs flailing, tears streaming down his face. "He knows," Frank shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Abernathy. Ask him where my boy is." The judge simply straightened his tie, his face a mask of sorrowful composure. He looked at the crowd, then at the struggling Frank, and shook his head with a look of profound pity. "The grief has broken him," he said, his voice filled with a terrible, false compassion. "Pray for him. Pray for this poor, lost soul." They dragged Frank away, his cries echoing across the manicured lawn of the park dedicated to his son. He was taken to the county hospital and placed on a 72-hour psychiatric hold. The official story was that he'd had a breakdown, a tragic but understandable consequence of his loss. Brodie Mullins was one of the deputies who held Frank down. He felt the man's bones, thin and bird-like, under his hands. He heard the raw, desperate conviction in his voice, and he saw the look in the judge's eyes. It was the same look Maria had seen years before. A flicker of cold, triumphant control. In that moment, Brodie's old buried suspicion roared back to life. Frank Vance wasn't crazy. He was telling the truth. The incident cemented the town's narrative. Frank Vance was a tragic figure, but an unstable one. The judge was a saint, patient and forgiving in the face of a madman's grief. The betrayal was complete. Frank had been publicly humiliated, his pain dismissed as madness. He had tried to scream the truth, and the world had covered its ears and called him crazy. He was released from the hospital 3 days later, a broken, defeated man. He never spoke of the judge again. The fight had gone out of him, leaving only a vast, empty silence. The injustice had not just escalated, it had triumphed. The monster had not only won, he had convinced the entire world he was a hero. 24 years is a long time to hold your breath. For Brodie Mullins, now the sheriff of Harmony Creek, the Vance case was a slow suffocation. He'd risen through the ranks, earned the respect of the town, and learned the hard, cynical lessons of law enforcement. He'd learned that some truths are too dangerous to uncover, that some monsters are too powerful to fight. The judge, now a frail octogenarian, was more untouchable than ever, a living landmark, his legacy set in stone. The file on Leo Vance gathered dust in a cabinet, a cold case, a testament to Brodie's one great failure. He'd see Frank Vance around town sometimes, a ghost shuffling through the grocery store. His eyes vacant, the fire long since extinguished. He never saw Maria. People said she never left the house. The Vance family had been buried alive. Then came the call from Atlanta. "My mother, Eleanor Pike, has passed away." The voice on the phone was crisp, efficient, devoid of emotion. "It was Catherine. I'm cleaning out her house. There's a lot of junk, but I found something. A box. In the attic. I think it's evidence." About the Vance boy, Brodie's heart, which he thought had long since turned to stone, gave a hard, painful lurch. Eleanor Pike, the neighbor, the quiet, terrified widow, who always looked like she was about to shatter. He drove to the Pike house that evening, his mind a whirlwind of long-dormant questions. The house was even more dilapidated than he remembered. Paint peeling, shutters hanging askew. Catherine met him at the door. She was a woman in her mid-40s now, her face sharp with a lifetime of resentment, but her eyes held a new, uncertain flicker. "It's in the attic," she said, without preamble. "I haven't touched anything else. Just the box I found. The one with the diary, and that's where Brodie found it. The key, the map." The voice of a 12-year-old boy reaching across 2.5 decades of silence. Leo Vance's journal. As Brodie stood in the suffocating heat of the attic, reading the boy's careful cursive, the world he thought he knew dissolved around him. The stillness game, the cold hands, the veiled threats, it was all there, a meticulous, heartbreaking record of a child's descent into hell. The monster wasn't a phantom. He had a name, a face, a pillar of the community. Judge Marcus Abernathy. The discovery of the lockbox, with its gallery of stolen childhoods and the undeveloped roll of film, was the plot twist that changed everything. This wasn't just about Leo anymore. This was a conspiracy of silence. A web of horror that stretched back decades, implicating not just the judge, but the quiet, terrified woman who had lived next door. Eleanor Pike hadn't just been a witness, she'd been a custodian of the evidence, a silent accomplice, shackled by fear. The creak of the floorboard, the appearance of his own deputy, Alan, with the judge himself in tow, was the moment the past exploded into the present. Brodie wasn't just a sheriff unearthing a cold case. He was a man who had stumbled into the monster's lair and found the monster waiting for him. "I believe you have something that belongs to me, Sheriff," The judge's voice was calm, but the threat beneath it was absolute. Alan's gun, steady and unwavering, was pointed at Brody's heart. The stakes had shifted with breathtaking speed. This was no longer about a historical crime. It was about survival. The journal and the photos were in his jacket, but the roll of film, the one piece of evidence that hadn't been seen, was a tight, dense knot in his fist. Brody's mind raced, adrenaline singing through his veins. He was a 55-year-old man with a bad knee and a weary heart, facing down a living legend and a compromised deputy. He had one advantage. They didn't know exactly what he'd found. They assumed he had the journal, maybe the old photos. They didn't know about the film. Judge Brody said, his voice surprisingly steady. He held up his empty hands, keeping the fist with the film canister clenched at his side. "I don't know what you're talking about." The judge's thin smile widened. "Please, Sheriff, let's not insult each other's intelligence." Eleanor was a sentimental old fool. "I knew this day would come eventually. I just hoped I'd be in the ground before it did. Now, be a good man and hand over the box and whatever you took from it." "And if I don't?" Brody asked, his eyes flicking from the judge to Alan. Alan's face was pale, his expression a mixture of fear and grim resolve. He was a young deputy with a new baby and a mountain of debt. Brody suddenly understood. The judge's influence hadn't waned with age. It had just become more refined, more insidious. He didn't need to threaten violence himself. He could buy it. "If you don't," the judge said, taking a slow step forward, his old bones creaking, "then Deputy Alan will be forced to defend himself against a distraught armed man who broke into a dead woman's house. It's a tragedy, really. You, a respected sheriff, finally cracking under the pressure of this old case. You became obsessed. You came here, found the girl's delusional diary, and when confronted, you lost it." Alan had no choice. The story was perfect, clean, just like the one he'd told Brody 24 years ago. The man was a genius of narrative, a master of plausible lies. Brody's mind was a blur. He had to get the film out. It was the only thing that mattered. The journal and the photos were damning, but they were old. The judge's lawyers could argue they were fakes, that Eleanor was delusional. But a photograph doesn't lie. And whatever was on that roll of film, the judge was desperate to keep it hidden. An idea, desperate and insane, sparked in his mind. He let his shoulders slump, his face fall into a mask of defeat. He slowly, deliberately, reached into his jacket pocket. Alan tensed, his finger tightening on the trigger. "All right, Judge," Brody sighed, his voice heavy with resignation. "You win." He pulled out Leo's journal. He held it up. "This is what you want." The judge's eyes gleamed. "That, and the photographs." Brody nodded slowly. He reached into his other pocket. His hand closed around the stack of photos, but his other hand, the one with the film, was already moving. In a single, fluid motion, he dropped to one knee, pretending to stumble, and flung the small, black canister as hard as he could. It sailed through the dusty air, a tiny black comet, and disappeared through the open attic door, clattering down the wooden stairs into the darkness of the second floor. "Not." The judge's composure finally cracked. The scream was thin, reedy, full of a panic that was decades old. It was the distraction Brody needed. As Alan's eyes instinctively followed the sound of the canister, Brody lunged. Not at Alan, but at the wall beside him. His shoulder slammed into a stack of old, precariously balanced boxes. They toppled over with a crash, a cascade of forgotten junkled clothes, books. A broken lamp raining down on the deputy. Alan cried out, stumbling backward, momentarily blinded and off balance. It was a window of maybe 2 seconds. Brody didn't waste it. He scrambled for the attic door, his bad knee screaming in protest. He half fell, half tumbled down the steep stairs, his hands scraping against the rough wood. He landed in a heap. On the second-floor landing, the wind knocked out of him. He could hear the judge shouting, Alan cursing. He didn't have time to look for the film canister. He just had to get out. He staggered to his feet and ran. He burst out of the Pike House's front door and into the humid Georgia night. He didn't run for his car. Alan would be there. He ran for the woods. He plunged into the darkness of the trees behind the house. The same woods where he had searched for Leo Vance all those years ago. Branches whipped at his face, thorns tore at his uniform. He could hear them behind him. Alan's younger, faster footsteps closing the distance. Mullins, stop. Don't make me do this. Alan shouted. Brody kept running, his lungs on fire. He was no longer a sheriff. He was prey. He was Leo Vance, running from the monster. The full, terrifying scope of the conspiracy was clear to him now. It wasn't just the judge, it was people like Alan, people trapped by debt or fear. People who had made a deal with the devil and were now forced to collect his debts. How many were there? How deep did the rot go? He stumbled and fell, his face hitting the damp earth. He lay there, gasping for breath, the smell of pine needles and decay filling his nostrils. He could see the beam of Alan's flashlight cutting through the trees, getting closer. This was it. The judge's story was about to come true. He was going to die out here, the obsessed cop who finally went too far. Then he heard another sound. A car engine, starting up down the street. Not his patrol car, a different one. And then, a voice. Get in. Brody looked up. A beat-up old sedan had pulled up to the edge of the woods, its headlights off. The passenger door was open. In the driver's seat was a silhouette. A woman's face barely visible in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. It was Catherine Pike. She had seen them. She had seen the judge and Alan go into the house after him. She hadn't driven away. She had waited. The daughter who had fled Harmony Creek, who had resented her mother's fear, had inherited her mother's curse. She was a witness. Brody didn't hesitate. He scrambled to his feet and sprinted the last 50 yards, diving headfirst into the open door of the car just as Alan burst out of the woods. Go, Brody yelled, pulling the door shut. Catherine stomped on the gas. The tires squealed on the pavement as the car shot forward, leaving a stunned deputy, Alan, standing in the middle of the road. Brody looked back. He could see the lights of the Pike house, the two figures standing on the lawn, watching them escape. He had the journal. He had the photographs. But the most crucial piece of evidence, the undeveloped roll of film, was lying somewhere in the darkness of that house, a tiny bomb waiting to be found by either side. Where are we going? Catherine asked, her voice shaking, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Brody's mind was clear, the adrenaline giving him a sharp, cold focus. The game had changed. He couldn't go to his own department. He didn't know who he could trust. The judge's tendrils were wrapped around the entire town. This was bigger than Harmony Creek. This needed to go public. It needed to be a firestorm. An explosion so big, the judge and his network of secrets couldn't possibly contain it. Get on the interstate, Brody said, his voice hard. Head north. To Atlanta. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact list. He had one last card to play, a long-shot bet he hadn't thought about in 20 years. A journalist he'd known back in the day. A bulldog reporter who had a nose for scandal and a deep-seated hatred for powerful men who abused their positions. The personal pain of the Vance family, the private horror of the stillness game, was about to become a public spectacle. The tension was no longer about a hidden secret, it was about a race. A race to find that roll of film. A race to get the story out before the judge could bury it, and them, for good. The plot twist wasn't the end. It was the lighting of the fuse. The explosion was yet to come. The Atlanta newsroom was a hive of controlled chaos, a symphony of ringing phones and clattering keyboards. Rick Donovan, a journalist whose rumpled suit and cynical demeanor were a testament to 30 years of chasing scandals, looked at the items spread across his desk, a child's leather-bound journal, a stack of faded, horrifying photographs, and the exhausted, desperate face of Sheriff Brody Mullins. Jesus Christ. Brody, Rick murmured, picking up one of the photos of Leo. You weren't kidding. This is biblical. The film is the key, Rick, Brody said, his voice hoarse. He and Catherine had been driving for hours. Their conversation, a frantic, piecemeal assembly of the last 24 years. Whatever is on that roll, it's what he's most afraid of. It's why he was willing to kill me to get it back. And it's still in the house, Catherine added, her voice stronger now, fueled by a righteous anger that had finally burned through her fear. We have to get it. The plan they hatched was audacious, dangerous, and worthy of the monster they were trying to slay. It was a three-pronged attack, a cinematic gambit designed for maximum public impact. Phase 1 was Rick's part. He would break the story. He would use the journal and the existing photos to create a firestorm. To put the judge on the defensive and shine a national spotlight on the dark secrets of Harmony Creek. Phase 2 was Brody's. He would use the media distraction to get back to the town, to the Pike House, and find that roll of film. And Phase 3. Phase 3 was the public execution. The story broke the next morning. It wasn't just a local news item. It was a national bombshell. Rick Donovan's article, published on the front page of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's website, was a masterpiece of controlled outrage. The saint of Harmony Creek, a judge, a missing boy, and a secret diary of horror. It was accompanied by a single, devastating image, a scanned page from Leo's journal, his childish cursive describing the stillness game, that the effect was instantaneous. The internet erupted. The story was shared millions of times. The hashtag Justice for Leo Vance, trending worldwide. Cable news networks dispatched satellite trucks to the small, bewildered town of Harmony Creek. The world's attention, a harsh, unforgiving Klieg-light, was now focused on Judge Marcus Abernathy. The judge, for the first time in his life, was caught off guard. He issued a statement through a high-powered Atlanta law firm, calling the story a vicious and delusional fantasy, and a cowardly attack on a man who has dedicated his life to public service. He blamed a disgraced and unstable sheriff, and the hysterical daughter of a mentally ill woman. But the narrative was no longer his to control. The photos of the other children, which Rick released a few hours later, added fuel to the fire. Families from neighboring towns began to come forward, people whose own children had become withdrawn and sullen after spending time with the benevolent judge. The foundation of his legacy was cracking. Under the cover of this media circus, Brody and Catherine drove back towards Harmony Creek. Brody was no longer a sheriff. He was a vigilante, operating outside the law he had sworn to uphold. He'd called in a favor from a retired state trooper, an old friend who owed him one, who agreed to meet them on the outskirts of town. "You've got 1 hour, Brody," the trooper said, handing him a set of bolt cutters and a high-powered flashlight. The local PD, what's left of them that aren't on the judge's payroll, are busy with the news crews at the judge's house. But they'll figure out what's going on eventually. The Pike House was dark, a silent, decrepit island in a sea of chaos. The yellow police tape that Alan had no doubt stretched across the door was a flimsy barrier. Brody cut through it and slipped inside, Catherine right behind him. The house was just as they'd left it, a scene of frantic escape. It clattered. Down the stairs, Brody whispered, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "It has to be here." They searched the second-floor landing, their hands sweeping across the dusty floorboards. They looked under furniture, behind curtains, their desperation growing with every passing second. Nothing. Maybe it rolled somewhere else, Catherine suggested, her voice tight with anxiety. Brody's heart sank. Had Alan found it after they'd fled? Was it already in the judge's hands? Then Catherine gasped. "Brody, look." Her flashlight was pointed at the wall, at a small, ornate heating grate near the floor. One of the slats was bent, and wedged inside, almost invisible in the shadows, was a small, black cylinder. The roll of film. Brody's hands trembled as he worked it free. He held it in his palm, a tiny object that held the power to destroy a giant. It felt like a sacred relic. They were out of the house in 30 seconds, their mission accomplished. They met the state trooper at the rendezvous point, and Brody handed him the film. "Get this, to Rick Donovan. No matter what." The trooper nodded, his face grim. "Godspeed, Brody." Now, for Phase 3, the public payoff. It wasn't enough to expose the judge. Brody needed to confront him. He needed the world to see the monster stripped of his power, his carefully constructed facade shattered for all to see. And he knew just how to do it. The next day was Sunday. For 60 years, Judge Abernathy had attended the 10 a.m. service at the Harmony Creek First Baptist Church. It was the bedrock of his public persona, the stage for his weekly performance of piety. Despite the scandal swirling around him, Brody knew the judge's arrogance would not allow him to hide. He would go to church. He would stand before his flock, his head held high. A martyr, weathering a storm of lies. Brody called Rick. He'll be at the church. I'm going in. I want a camera there. Live. Brody. That's insane, Rick protested. His people will be there. It's a trap. It's not a trap, Brody said, his voice cold and certain. It's a stage. And the final act is about to begin. The scene outside the church was a media frenzy. Satellite trucks, reporters, and protesters holding signs that read "Justice for Leo" and "Believe the Children." The judge's black Lincoln pulled up through the throng, and he emerged, looking frail but defiant, his lawyer at his side. He ignored the shouted questions and walked, stone-faced, up the steps and into the sanctuary. Inside, the church was packed. Some were there to support him, their faces set with a stubborn loyalty. Others were there out of morbid curiosity, and some, a few, were there with a dawning horror in their eyes. The story in the paper having planted a seed of doubt that was beginning to sprout. The service began. The hymns and prayers, a surreal counterpoint to the tension that crackled in the air. The pastor, a man whose salary was subsidized by the judge's generous tithes, gave a sermon on forgiveness and the evils of false witness. Then, just as the service was ending, the side door of the sanctuary opened. Sheriff Brody Mullins walked in. He wasn't wearing his uniform. He was in civilian clothes, his face grim, his eyes locked on the man in the front pew. He walked slowly, deliberately, down the center aisle. A gasp went through the congregation. The organist trailed off, the last note hanging in the air like a question. The judge turned, his face contorting in a mask of fury. "Get him out of here," he hissed to his lawyer. But Brody kept walking. He stopped at the front of the church, turning to face the congregation. In the back, a cameraman from a national news network, tipped off by Rick, lifted his camera, the red recording light blinking on. They were live. "I'm sorry to interrupt your service," Brody began, his voice calm and clear, amplified by the church's acoustics. "But we're here today to talk about false witness. We're here to talk about secrets. And we're here to talk about Leo Vance." A murmur went through the crowd. The judge stood up, his face purple with rage. "This is a house of God. You have no right." "I have every right," Brody said, his voice rising. "Because for 24 years, you have used this house, this town, and your power to hide a monstrous sin." He turned his attention to the back of the church, and I'm not the only one who thinks so. The main doors of the sanctuary swung open. Standing there, silhouetted against the bright morning light, were Frank and Maria Vance. It was the first time Maria had been seen in public in over a decade. She was thin, her face a roadmap of grief, but her eyes burned with a fire that had been reignited. Frank stood beside her, sober and straight, his hand holding hers. They were no longer ghosts. They were witnesses. They began to walk down the aisle, their steps slow but steady. The congregation parted for them like the Red Sea. "What is the meaning of this?" The judge sputtered, his composure finally shattering. "This is a reckoning, Marcus," Brody said, using the judge's first name for the first time. The disrespect was a slap in the face. At that exact moment, Rick Donovan played his final card. On a massive screen behind the pulpit, a screen normally used for hymn lyrics, an image flickered to life. It was a photograph, a new one that no one had ever seen before. It was from the roll of film. The quality was grainy, the lighting harsh, but the content was unmistakable. It was the judge's workshop. But this time, there was someone else in the photo with the child on the table. It was the judge himself. He was leaning over the boy, a syringe in his hand, his face a mask of intense, predatory concentration. The stillness game wasn't just about taking pictures, it was about sedation. It was about complete and utter control. A collective, horrified gasp sucked the air from the room. The image was the smoking gun, the irrefutable proof. Another photo flashed on the screen. This one was of the judge, his back to the camera, standing over a section of the concrete floor in his basement that was freshly poured. In the corner of the frame, a small red t-shirt lay discarded on the ground. Maria Vance let out a sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. Frank held her, his own face a mess of tears. The judge stared at the screen, his face ashen, his mouth agape. The mask was gone. The saint, the benefactor, the pillar of the community, had vanished. All that was left was a shrunken, pathetic old man, his evil laid bare for the world to see. He stumbled backward, his hand clutching his chest. He looked wildly around the church, at the faces of the people who had adored him. He saw no loyalty now, only horror, disgust, betrayal. It was art, he whispered, his voice a dry, rattling hiss. They were imperfect. I was making them perfect. Still, pure, he collapsed. His frail body hit the plush red carpet of the altar with a soft, final thud. The cinematic payoff was not a courtroom verdict or a police arrest. It was this, a public execution by truth. A confession not of words, but of a body giving out under the crushing weight of its own sins. In the very house of the God he had pretended to serve, his crimes projected for all to see. The monster had been slain, not by a weapon, but by the light. The camera was still rolling, broadcasting the silent, shocking tableau to a world that could not look away. Justice, explosive and absolute, had finally come to Harmony Creek. The silence that followed the judge's collapse was a profound, sacred thing. It was the silence of a fever breaking, of a long and violent storm finally passing. For a moment, no one moved. The congregation, the reporters, Brody, the Vances. They were all frozen, suspended in the aftershock of the truth. The image on the screen, the judge's freshly poured concrete tomb for his young victim, remained a silent, damning epitaph. Then, the spell broke. A woman, in the choir loft screamed. The sound shattered the stillness, and chaos erupted. People scrambled for the exits, their faces a mixture of horror and a strange, shameful relief. They were fleeing not just the scene, but their own complicity, their own willful blindness. The news crew surged forward, their cameras capturing the frantic, undignified end of an era. Brody Mullins didn't move. He stood by the altar, watching. As paramedics rushed in and surrounded the fallen judge, he felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction. Just a vast, hollow emptiness. The ghost he had chased for 24 years was finally gone. But its haunting had left a permanent void. He turned to the Vances. Maria was weeping openly now, her body shaking with a grief that was a quarter-century old, but as raw as if it were yesterday. Frank held her, his own tears tracing paths through the weary lines on his face. These were not tears of victory, but of release. The poison of unspoken truth, of dismissed pain, was finally being purged. Brody walked over to them. He didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry" felt like an insult. "It's over" felt like a lie. It would never be over for them. He simply placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. Frank looked up, his eyes meeting Brody's. In their depths, Brody saw not just gratitude, but a flicker of the man Frank had been before the darkness had consumed him. "Thank you, Sheriff," he whispered, his voice thick. "You brought our boy home." In the weeks that followed, Harmony Creek was a town in mourning for its own soul. The judge's death, officially ruled a massive coronary, was a quiet, unceremonious affair. There was no grand funeral, no public eulogies. His house, the white-columned monument to a lie, was boarded up, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at a town that no longer revered its owner. It became a place for teenagers to dare each other to touch the front door. A haunted house in the town's collective imagination. The investigation that followed was a formality, but a necessary one. The basement of the judge's house was excavated. They found Leo's remains exactly where the photograph indicated, under a section of the workshop floor. The discovery was a final brutal confirmation, a physical end to a story that had lived for so long in the realm of ghosts and whispers. They found other things too. Trophies. Small, personal items belonging to other children. A secret, sick collection of stolen innocence. The judge's network of accomplices, the men-like deputy, Alan, who had been bought or blackmailed, was dismantled. Alan, facing a long prison sentence, gave a full confession. His testimony painting a chilling portrait of the judge's insidious power. Harmony Creek had to rebuild itself from the ashes of its most cherished myth. The process was painful. Awkward neighbors who had once shared pleasantries now avoided each other's gazes, ashamed of what they had chosen not to see. The name Abernathy, once a source of pride, was now a curse. The park, the scholarship, the plaques, anything bearing his name, was quietly removed. An attempt to erase a history that was now a source of profound shame. For Brody, the aftermath was a quiet, lonely peace. He was hailed as a hero, a tenacious bulldog of justice, but he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had simply done his job 24 years too late. He found he could finally sleep through the night without dreaming of a lost boy in a red t-shirt. He retired a year later, the fire in his belly finally extinguished, leaving behind a department that was slowly, painfully, rebuilding its own integrity. Catherine Pike sold her mother's house and moved back to Atlanta for good. Before she left, she met Brody for coffee. The resentment in her face was gone, replaced by a quiet, somber understanding. "My mother was a coward," she said, stirring her latte. "But I think she was also a victim. She was just as trapped as those kids were." She had finally forgiven her mother, not for her silence, but for her fear. In cleaning out the house, she had found not just a diary, but a measure of peace. The most profound change was in the Vance family. With the truth finally out, they began the slow, arduous process of healing. Frank stopped drinking. The anger that had fueled him for so long was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding sorrow. He and Maria started talking again, not about the past, but about the small things, the weather, the garden, a shared memory of Leo learning to ride his bike. They were rediscovering each other. Two survivors learning to navigate a world that finally made a terrible kind of sense. They gave Leo the funeral he had been denied for 24 years. The entire town came, not out of morbid curiosity this time, but out of a genuine shared sense of atonement. They filled the pews of the same church where the judge's evil had been exposed. Their presence a silent apology. Brody stood at the back, watching. Frank and Maria sat in the front pew, holding hands. They were not broken anymore. They were scarred, yes, deeply and irrevocably, but they were whole. After the service, Brody drove out to the newly established cemetery plot. It was on a small hill, overlooking the creek, where Leo had been supposed to meet his friends that long ago August afternoon. The headstone was simple. Leo Vance's beloved son, finally, at RESD Brody, stood before the grave for a long time. The Georgia sun warm on his face. The cicadas were humming their relentless summer song, but it no longer sounded like a scream. It was just a sound, the sound of life going on. He thought about the journal, the small leather-bound book that had started it all. It was in an evidence locker now, a sterile, numbered artifact of a closed case. But for Brody, it would always be a living thing, the voice of a boy who had used the only weapon he had, words, to fight a monster. He hadn't won the battle in his own lifetime, but his words had armed the people who came after him. They were an echo that had refused to fade, a testament to the fact that even when buried, the truth does not die, it just waits. He reached out and touched the cool granite of the headstone, his fingers tracing the boy's name. The cost of this truth had been immense, a price paid in years, in lives, in the very soul of a town. But as he looked out over the peaceful sun-dappled landscape, he knew that the cost of the silence would have been infinitely greater. The haunting was over. The emotional echo that remained was one of profound sadness, but also of a quiet, hard-won peace. The ghost of Leo Vance had finally been laid to rest,